Hello everyone, this is Majid, and in this tutorial I want to show you how we can use and implement data mapper design pattern in PHP. A data mapper is a data access layer that performs bidirectional transfer of data between a persistent data store like databases or external APIs and in-memory data representation, and also it has known as a domain layer. This pattern keeps the in-memory representation and the persistent data store independent of each other. In this tutorial, we will see how we can implement a simple data mapper layer between two resources that I mentioned previously. We are going to use Json Placeholder Api to get a dummy data of a single user and map this data into our user class. The user class has two simple functions, getID and getEmail, and also for accessing the external data, we will implement a utility. Maybe it can be any kind of storage method or request handler, and we will simply pass this functionality into our mapper. So let's jump to our code and see what we are going to do today. In this tutorial, I want to simply start writing test. I want to start with simple test function, and for that I need to install PHP unit. So let me install PHP unit, and also I need to create a class, for example data mapper test. So what happened? Data mapper test .php to handling our test. Data mapper test that extend test case. So let me import PHP unit class. And let me implement simple function to see it works fine or not. Test foo, and also it returns nothing, so I mention void and this assert same, for example foo equal to foo. So yes, that's work. So let me create an app directory and also autoloading this directory, autoload psr4 app and app directory. So just let me run composer dump autoload to autoloading the app directory, and for now let me require once the autoload file. So let me design our app. So at first, I want to maybe API request class or any API request handler to get the data from external resources. So at this time, I need API request. And maybe it needs base URL. And after that, I want to create a mapper object. And we simply pass the API request into the user mapper. And this mapper contains a user, and it is our mapper. And it has some functionality like find by ID. And we can simply pass the user ID and get the user. So after that, I want to I expect that user get ID function returns 3 as the number we send it to the function. So at first we have these classes, but we have no any implementation for them. Now let's doing our job. Okay, so at first I want to create API request class .php. After that, I need another class called user_mapper.php. And for the last one, I need user.php class. So first, our API request class receive a base URL. And in this case, let me complete our class. So here we have API request, and also it has constructor. And it receive base URL a string. And also, I think it require another function called get. And get function simply receive a path, and also it return an array of data. So for this function, I will use a built-in PHP function called file get content, and trying to accessing the URL and get the information of that URL and receive it in PHP. I put them in a variable called, for example, data string, and I trying to cast it to the array using JSON decode. And after that, I simply pass and return the data array. So I think for API request class, that's it. It simply receive a path and just getting the content of the path as a string and decode it and change it to the array and simply pass and return the array. So for API class, I think that's it, and just simply add namespace app. For user class, we have simply a user that it receive ID, and also it receive email. And also it has two functions, get ID that simply return ID, and get email. Simply pass a string. So for user class, I think that's it. And for mapper class, I think it needs just simple function, for example, called find by ID. And in this case, we simply receive ID. String. And it return a user object. So let me create the constructor. And in this case, it simply receive an object of API request that we created here. So let me define it as a private variable. So in this case, for getting the user by ID, I just simply pass API, receive API at simply pass the URL of the user, and we mention the ID in the URL. So in this case, we have user array, and simply return new user, and we just pass ID and email. So let me check the JSON Placeholder API. So you can see that we have a dummy data that I use JSON placeholder. And for example, we can use a /1 and we can simply get the first user. And by changing the URL, we can get another user. So this part of URL is a base URL that I want to mention it here. So for getting the user, I need to add users and / the ID of each user. So I just simply pass the ID to the find by ID and I get the result. And also after that, after we getting the array of data, I simply create a user and pass the ID and the email and just simply return it from the find by ID function. And we can see here we have an object of user. So let me run the test to see if it's work or not. Simply vendor bin PHP unit data mapper test. So yes, we have an error here. Data mapper undefined variable base URL. Here, yes, we have problem here. So let me test it again. And yes, we can see that all of our test is passed. So just let me check it for maybe another assert for getting the email. I just want to simply get email and I expect the email to be equal with this value. So if I want to run another one, no, it's failed because we use ID3 and in this case we are using the user with ID1. So let me change it and use this email. And yes, now it works. So let me overview this for another time. We simply create API request that it has a function called get. It requests to the external server or maybe another database or any data storage and it get the data. It can be anything, maybe array, integer, or anything. And also we have a user that for creating user we should pass the ID and email to that. And also we have two simple functions like get ID and get email. And in this case, we have a user mapper that map the array data or persistent layer data into in-memory data. So in this case, we called find by ID, and in this case, we trying to use user array and simply create a user object and map this data to the user class. So I think for today, that's it, and it's enough. So do not forget to subscribe and like this video. And also feel free to ask any question in the comment sections. And have a nice day.